So today we'll be concluding our two-part exploration of what the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote about games. Possibly the most famous case of a philosopher doing this, and certainly one of the most discussed in game studies. In our last episode we had a bit of an introduction to Wittgenstein's life and philosophy, and today we're going to get into what he actually says about games and why he talks about games at all. So Wittgenstein talked about games in a book called The Philosophical Investigations, arguably the most important thing he ever wrote, and one of the most influential works of philosophy of the 20th century. In it, he uses games as an important part of his arguments about language, effectively drawing an analogy between language and games. So he talks about games quite a lot. The Investigations was published after he'd died, and it's a bizarre book in a number of ways, but a very exciting one, an absolute joy to read if you like philosophy. In the preface, which Wittgenstein wrote in 1945, 6 years before his death, he says he doesn't want to spare people the trouble of thinking and would like to stimulate in readers thoughts of their own. He achieves this with aplomb. It's a fascinating book, which I think thoroughly deserves its place in the history of philosophy. And he downplays its significance so much in its preface. He basically says, it's just a collection of notes I've made over the last 16 years. I've tried to rearrange them in a way that makes sense, but I kind of couldn't. I've tried to produce a good book, but it didn't turn out that way. Absolute nonsense. The Investigations doesn't proceed like many philosophical texts do, which often start off by clearly specifying what they're going to argue and how. Rather, Wittgenstein just thinks in dialogue with himself. He'll express a thought, and an imagined interlocutor will come along and criticise it, question it, and he'll reply to the interlocutor. So it's really like reading someone actually thinking, in conversation with themselves, and it makes you think yourself. Often he'll give examples of things related to what he's been saying and just leave them hanging, and you have to draw conclusions for yourself and figure out what he's really trying to get at with these examples. It's written in short, numbered paragraphs, which appear as snapshots of thoughts taking the reader on a journey through a wide variety of topics, but all united by the thing that consistently occupied him throughout his career: language. His thinking about language evolved over the course of his life, and he says very clearly that the thoughts expressed in the Investigations can only be properly understood in contrast with his older way of thinking. By this he means the thinking he expressed in his earlier book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which gives a theory of language that he later criticises extensively in the Investigations. So one way that philosophers think about language is to think about how words mean what they mean, what the connection between words and their meanings is, how these meanings combine to form sentences, and how these sentences, or what philosophers call propositions, are then able to convey their meaning. Basically, how does language work? How does the word table connect to the objects it represents? How is the proposition "it's raining outside" able to communicate its meaning to me? How do poetry and literature convey such emotion and beauty? Why am I able to be moved or hurt by the words of another person? What's underlying all of this? Thinking of something as underlying all this might lead us to think that all words and propositions work the same way, that they are all united by something, and that no matter the different things they do or the different uses they all have, all propositions ultimately do the same thing and take the same form. This was basically what Wittgenstein ended up arguing in the Tractatus, where he claimed to have discovered the general form of the proposition, literally the general form that every proposition takes, how every logically possible proposition in language works. Wittgenstein's answer to this takes the form of what's often called the picture theory of language. Language works by giving us pictures of things, allowing us to picture things, and allowing us to communicate these pictures to others and have them be able to think them. As Wittgenstein says, a proposition is a picture of reality. But what is a picture? Well, for Wittgenstein, a picture is something that represents a state of affairs which is possible in a possible reality. And what it represents can be true or false. Now, what on earth does that mean? Well, let's take a random example of a proposition. There is an apple on my desk. This proposition gives you a picture of a state of affairs. a possible situation which is simple, thinkable, and understandable. In saying this to you, I take a picture of reality, communicate it to you, and now you have a picture in your head, a thought, of this state of affairs, of there being an apple on my desk. For Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, this is the absolute essence of language. This is how it works. But there isn't an apple on my desk. I just made that up. But the sentence still made sense, and you were still able to think what the situation would be like if it were true. There's no logical contradiction involved in the idea of there being an apple on my desk. It's a possible situation. It just happened that I was lying, and that there is no apple on my desk. This is what Wittgenstein means when he says that pictures can be true or false. The pictures that we make in language, our propositions, can either be true or false, but they represent what things would be like if they were true, and they say that they are true. There is no apple on my desk, but the sentence in which I tell you that there is, tells you that there is an apple on my desk, and represents how things would be like if the proposition were true. But then you compare the sentence with reality, and you find out that it's not true. Just like how we can have pictures or paintings of people that don't really exist. Sherlock Holmes isn't a real person, but there are tons of pictures of him, and these pictures put forward a possible idea of how Sherlock Holmes would be if he really existed. He just doesn't exist. But what about the idea that pictures represent states of affairs which are possible in a possible reality? In a statement which expresses a hugely controversial idea that philosophers in logic and philosophy of mind still fiercely debate about, Wittgenstein says, what is thinkable is possible too. So pictures represent states of affairs which are thinkable in a thinkable reality. Think about this idea. I pick up a stone, I hold it in my hand, and let go of it. But instead of falling to the ground, it stays floating in the air. Couldn't possibly happen on Earth, but this idea still makes logical sense. You can picture what the situation would be like if it happened. We know that gravity behaves differently on the moon, for instance. So it's totally thinkable that I could pick up a stone on the moon, drop it, and it would float in the air rather than falling to the ground. So this is actually possible and actually thinkable in our reality. But even if I specified that the situation took place on Earth, you could still understand what the sentence means. You understand what stones are, you understand what the words picking up, dropping, and floating mean, and you understand what Earth means. You can put all these ideas together in your mind and form a picture of what things would be like if I picked up a stone on Earth and it floated in the air when I dropped it. There's no logical contradiction between any of these ideas, it just doesn't happen in reality. But what if I told you there's a square circle on my table? There is a logical contradiction here. Something can't be both a square and a circle. This proposition doesn't let you picture anything. We can't picture logical contradictions because our minds are not able to imagine them. They violate the laws of thinking. According to Wittgenstein's theory, propositions involving contradictions, or which try to say things which cannot be pictured in thought, which cannot be thought, are simply nonsense. Sense is reserved for propositions that picture things that we can think. So for Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, language works by making and communicating pictures of reality, pictures which represent logically coherent situations, which could either be true or false. Every proposition in language, from the mundane to the profound, the trivial to the important, works like this and takes this general form. This is why Wittgenstein says the general form of a proposition is "this is how things stand." Whenever we use language, whenever we utter a coherent sentence, whenever we text or email, whenever we say anything to another person, we're taking a snapshot of reality and saying this is how things stand. This is how things are. By the time Wittgenstein started compiling the investigations from his various notebooks, he thought very differently about language and became critical of his earlier views. And it's in this criticism that he speaks about games. Perhaps the most important concept in the investigations is the language game, which Wittgenstein uses to draw an analogy between games and language as a way of criticising his older way of thinking. Wittgenstein's criticism of his older views is complex, but an important part of it is that he comes to believe that it's completely mistaken to think there is only a single type of proposition, or only one thing, really, that language does, as much as philosophers would like to think there's only one. Language is so complex, and words and propositions are used in so many different ways for so many different reasons, that it makes no sense to try and reduce language ultimately down to one thing, or one function, as he tried to earlier by formulating the general form of the proposition. At some point in the investigations, Wittgenstein says there are actually countless kinds of sentence, countless different kinds of use of all the things we call words, signs, or sentences. And new ones are coming into existence, and others are going out of existence all the time. The language game is one of the ideas that Wittgenstein uses to illustrate this, to show us the many different things we do with language, and the many ways we use language in our everyday lives, where words make perfect sense and their meanings don't seem strange, like when we're doing philosophy. He uses language games to describe language and the activities into which it is woven, emphasizing that language is not an abstract logical concern, but something which always has a context, something which is always woven into the fabric of our lives, something which is always being used to do something. Language games are the things we do with language, the things we use it to accomplish, the activities we partake in using language. Doing a YouTube video is a language game. I'm using language to do it. Teaching a class is a language game. Reciting poetry is a language game. Breaking up with someone, arranging a night out on WhatsApp, convincing someone to go, ordering fast food. These are all language games, instances of language and the activities language is woven into in everyday human life. This is why he says that the word language game is used here to emphasize the fact that the speaking of language is part of an activity or a form of life. He then gives a really interesting list and asks us to consider the variety of language games in the following examples. Giving orders and acting on them. Describing an object by its appearance or by its measurements. Constructing an object from a description, a drawing. Reporting an event. Speculating about the event. Forming and testing a hypothesis. Presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams. Making up a story and reading one. Acting in a play. Singing rounds. Guessing riddles. Cracking a joke. Telling one. Solving a problem in applied arithmetic. Translating from one language into another. Requesting, thanking, cursing, greeting, praying. In everyday life, we're not constantly doing the same thing over and over with language. We're doing countless different things with it, using it for countless different purposes, in countless different ways. So it's not that helpful for a philosophical theory to come along and say, they're actually all doing the same thing. What does that really tell us? There's a really good example Wittgenstein gives here. Imagine looking at a toolbox and trying to come up with a theory about what every tool in the box does. Suppose someone said, all tools modify something. So a hammer modifies the position of a nail, a saw modifies the shape of a board, and so on. And what's modified by a ruler, a glue pot, or nails? Our knowledge of a thing's length, the temperature of the glue, and the solidity of a box. Would anything be gained by this assimilation of expressions? A hammer obviously modifies something, the position of a nail. So does a saw, the shape of a piece of wood. But in these weirder, less obvious cases, like the ruler and the glue pot, is modify really the clearest way of describing what they do? Perhaps they could be if we stretched the meaning of modify a bit, but then what do we gain from doing this? The philosopher Stephen Mulhall describes the significance behind this really nicely in a brilliant article and an absolutely fantastic piece of philosophical criticism called How Complex is a Lemon, where he reviews a book called Object-Oriented Ontology by Graham Harman. So talking about this example from Wittgenstein, Mulhall says, if temperature and a mental state can be objects of modification just as easily as the position of a nail or the shape of a board, Our definition of modification will become increasingly loose and baggy, so calling something a modifier will tell us less and less about how it actually works. At the limit, maybe we could accommodate every tool within our modification theory, but only at the price of evacuating the theory of any content. Rather than revealing the underlying essence of tools is that they modify something, we have simply recast modifier as a notational equivalent of tool. As Wittgenstein puts it, we have said nothing whatever. Wittgenstein basically realised that he was doing this in his search for the general proposition and in his picture theory. He'd created a theory which was able to accommodate every proposition in language, but only at the cost of telling us basically nothing about how actual propositions work in everyday real life, or at least which could only tell us about how a small fraction of propositions work in everyday life. He'd fallen into the philosophical trap of constructing a general theory of something, but which is so general it's kind of useless, completely detached from how we actually use language. In everyday language, the meanings and uses of words and propositions are given to them by their context, by the uses that we're putting them to, the language games that we're playing with them, and their role in the language game. There may be many cases of language use, like me telling you there's an apple on my desk, which involve propositions functioning like pictures, cases in which I'm directly trying to give someone a representation in their minds of a particular situation. In this case, my sentence functions as a direct picture of the objects that the words ordinarily mean, which might lead us to think this is what language in general does, or that particular words mean what they do by having some kind of necessary connection to their particular object. But this is not how propositions function all the time, or how words work all the time. What if I said there's an apple on my desk over a walkie-talkie as part of a secretive military operation, and that was the code phrase that we'd agreed on for a particular event, such as an important diplomat entering a building, an event which has nothing to do with apples or desks? I'm certainly not using that proposition to picture an actual apple on a desk, and the event I'm using these words to convey isn't connected to the actual words in the sentence. They could have been any random words. You could still argue that my language here is still picturing something, is picturing a diplomat entering a building. We'd just agreed on different words for it. But then this means that meaning isn't a direct picture-like connection between words and objects, but that meaning can shift, change, and be used in different ways depending on context. That meaning depends more on human agreement than a necessary connection between words and their meanings. The same words can mean very different things depending on the situation, so it's not the case that apple necessarily always pictures an apple. Also, in the covert military operation, is it really correct to say that I'm using this phrase to picture something? I'm not really trying to get the person on the other end of the walkie-talkie to picture this event. That's not the goal of what I'm trying to do here. I'm covertly alerting them to the fact that an event has happened and prompting or ordering them to react to that situation in a certain way, to follow the diplomat, to protect them, steal a document from them, whatever the operation is about. The picture theory can still say that my language is picturing something, or still making someone picture something, but is this really saying anything useful at all about what's going on here? Saying that these two uses of there's an apple on my desk are both instances of picturing reality, in which I'm saying this is how things stand. Sure, they kind of both are, and maybe it works well as a description of the first case, but it doesn't tell us much that's relevant about the second. So we're back to the tools are modifiers example, where we can accommodate very different things using the same theory, but only at the cost of it being kind of a useless theory that tells us very little about how the different things it's supposed to accommodate actually work. In the second case, we would have been much better off and understood much more if we'd just paid attention to the context, to how the words were actually being used, rather than applying a general theory of language to it. One of Wittgenstein's later points is that this is a mistake philosophers make all the time. When philosophers puzzle over the meanings of words like knowledge, good, evil, justice, meaning, God, and so on, They're forgetting how the words they're puzzling about are actually used in everyday language. If you want to know the meaning of a word or a proposition, look and see how it's used. There it's not mysterious. There's no deeper riddle, no mystery to be solved. Everything is there, out in the open. Look at the context. Look at the language game. But why does Wittgenstein call these language games at all? Why not language things or language activities? Well, the reason is that he thinks there are a lot of commonalities between language and games, and some kind of an analogy to be drawn between the two. Not to say that language is a game, but if we look at the two together, we can learn a lot about language and how it functions and how we should understand it. Both language and games often involve activities bounded by strict rules, for instance. Grammar has rules. There are correct and incorrect ways of using words and forming propositions in particular contexts. And there are rules and conventions which govern our social interactions and activities depending on what we're doing. Using poor grammar and forming sentences badly is considered unacceptable in academic circles, but in everyday conversation it doesn't matter. The rules of the language game depend on the situation. Different games have different rules. There are different levels of strictness when it comes to rules, and sometimes there are no strict rules at all. Probably the most famous part of Wittgenstein's discussion of games comes when he thinks about a possible objection to the criticism of his earlier work that we've been discussing. In his earlier work, he'd searched for the general form of the proposition, the thing that unites all language. But he came to give up this project and think that it was misconceived to begin with. There is no general form of the proposition to be found. Language is much too complicated and varied for that. But philosophers might come along and say that we can't really get along without general theories of things. That if you can't specify the essence of something, then all our thinking about it will be somehow groundless. We need the general theory of what language is, or what language does, what all language, all propositions have in common, because that's the ground for our thinking and theorizing about it. Without a solid foundation, none of this gets off the ground. Here's how Wittgenstein phrases this in the Investigations. Here we come up against the great question that lies behind all these considerations. For someone might object against me, you make things easy for yourself. You talk about all sorts of language games, but have nowhere said what is essential to a language game, and so to language. What is common to all of these activities and makes them into language or parts of language. So you let yourself off the very part of the investigation that once gave you the most headache, the part about the general form of the proposition and of language. And this is true. Instead of pointing out something common to all that we call language, I'm saying that these phenomena have no one thing in common, in virtue of which we use the same word for all, but there are many different kinds of affinity between them. And on account of this affinity, or these affinities, we call them languages. So he's outright rejecting the idea that we need to point out what's common to all language, and what's common to all language games. He even says that this is impossible because there isn't anything common to all of them. There is no general form of the proposition. There isn't one single thing that all language has in common. Is there anything else we can say something similar about? You guessed it, games. We got there in the end. Wittgenstein continues, and this is the bit that you quite often see game scholars quoting. Consider, for example, the activities that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, athletic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say they must have something in common or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to them all. For if you look at them, you won't see anything that's common to them all, but similarities, affinities, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. Look, for example, at board games with their various affinities. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out, and others appear. When we pass next to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are they all entertaining? Compare chess with noughts and crosses. Or is there always winning and losing, or competition between players? Think of patience. In ball games there is winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of singing and dancing games. Here we have the element of entertainment, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? And we can go through the many other groups of games in this way. We can see how similarities crop up and disappear. And the upshot of these considerations is we see a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, similarities in the large and in the small. So for Wittgenstein, this is just as true for language as it is for games. If you look at games, you won't find any one single thing in all of them. Not all of them have cards, a ball, winning and losing, competition between people. Not even all of them have rules. If you look at games, what you'll actually see is a complicated network of overlapping similarities, with no one thing common to all games. Wittgenstein continues, I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, colour of eyes, gait, temperament, and so on and so forth, overlap and crisscross in the same way. And I shall say, games form a family, and likewise the kinds of number, for example, form a family. Why do we call something a number? Well, perhaps because it has a direct affinity with several things that have hitherto been called number. And this can be said to give it an indirect affinity with other things that we also call numbers. And we extend our concept of number, as in spinning a thread we twist fibre on fibre. And the strength of the thread resides not in the fact that some one fibre runs through its whole length, but in the overlapping of many fibres. There's so much going on here. He's completely overturning a particular philosophical picture of language and meaning, and even the idea that we need a general foundational theory of. Rather than there being a single essence to language or games, there is a hugely complicated network of family resemblances, similarities and affinities which overlap with each other without one thing being present in every single case. But importantly, we don't need there to be. We don't need one single foundation. We don't need to specify the one thing running through it all. We don't need to say what's common to all language. We actually can't, but we're no worse off for the fact that we can't. We get along just fine without doing this. And he brings in the image of a fibre woven from different threads to explain this. The strength of a fibre doesn't come from there being one thread running through the whole thing. The strength comes from the overlapping and the twisting of many fibres together. Our words and concepts are like the fibre. They're made of many twisted threads, and this is where they get their strength. We add to the fibre of concepts by using them repeatedly, by finding other applications of them, other objects and phenomena which they cover. The more we use them, the more uses and applications we find for them. The stronger they become, and the more we spin the fibre, which isn't being held together by one thread, it's being held together by many. This means that often our concepts are not neatly bounded, with clear edges that we can delineate with precision. And nor do they need to be. The fibre doesn't have a clearly prescribed beginning and end. It begins and ends where we need it to, and we can keep adding to it if we find more threads. And certain threads can be cut off or drop off naturally, without the strength of the entire fibre being compromised. And so it goes for our concepts, including the concept of game. Wittgenstein asks, how is the concept of a game bounded? What still counts as a game, and what no longer does? Can you say where the boundaries are? No. You can draw some, for there aren't any drawn yet, but this never bothered you before when you used the word game. But then the use of the word is unregulated. The game we play with it is unregulated. It's not everywhere bounded by rules, but no more are there any rules for how high one may throw the ball in tennis, or how hard. And yet tennis is a game for all that, and has rules too. Language isn't something we can legislate completely, specify all the rules for, just as we cannot specify every single possible use of a word, or all the meanings it might have, if for no other reason than the fact that new ones are being produced constantly and we cannot predict the future. Language is open, evolving. Our concepts are open and evolving. Trying to specify every possible use of a word, every rule it could be used to follow or break, would be just as absurd as introducing a rule in tennis for how high a player is allowed to throw the ball in the air when they serve it. It would be impossible to regulate, is unnecessary, doesn't add anything of value, and would get in the way of a perfectly good game which functioned perfectly well and was perfectly well regulated by the rules without our doing this. The rules don't need to completely regulate every single thing that happens in a game for it to be a fully functioning game. And the same goes for language games and our concepts. Just because our concepts don't have clear boundaries and all their applications cannot be fully specified, doesn't mean they're not usable, or that we don't understand them, or that we need to be somehow worried about this. When was the last time you were worried about the fact that the definition of game is actually kind of hard to pin down? It's not that you can't define it, or can't communicate its meaning to others. Most parents, at some point, have to explain to their children what a game is, and they do so perfectly well, and the child understands. About this, Wittgenstein says, "How would we explain to someone what a game is? I think that we'd describe games to him, and we might add the description, 'This and similar things are called games.' And do we know any more ourselves? Is it just that we can't tell others exactly what a game is? But this is not ignorance. We don't know the boundaries because none have been drawn. To repeat, we can draw the boundary for a special purpose. Does it take this to make the concept usable? Not at all. Except perhaps for that special purpose. One can say that the concept of a game is a concept with blurred edges. But is a blurred concept a concept at all? Is a photograph that's not sharp a picture of a person at all? Is it even always an advantage to replace a picture that is not sharp by one that is? Isn't one that isn't sharp often just what we need? The concept of a game was an important one for Wittgenstein because it's very clearly reflective of our language and concepts. It's like many, probably most of our concepts. It has blurred edges, shifting boundaries, and covers many different things that don't have one single thing in common between all of them. This might not be the most intuitive idea of how definition works. We might think that a definition is supposed to pick out precisely what is common to a group of things. But Wittgenstein argues that language is such a complex, evolving, weird thing that it can actually give us mistaken impressions of how it works. The meanings of words do not just correlate with single objects. Most of the time, our definitions don't cover all they are supposed to perfectly. And often, definitions can be hard to pin down. And that's just fine. Language doesn't have a single unifying essence to discover, and there are no philosophical problems. Philosophers are just confused about how language works. I'll finish up by addressing this last point. I study philosophy, and I really like Wittgenstein. I find his work valuable, and I'm still very impressed with it, even though I've been reading him for years now. He's a philosopher whose work I come back to quite often, that I write about and think about often. And I'm always challenged by and discovering new things about. I think he got a lot right, but I don't agree with him that there are no genuine philosophical problems. If there weren't, I might be out of a job. But I do think many philosophical problems are misconceived, badly formulated, or are the result of misunderstanding and misusing concepts. There's a lot of philosophical argument that could be cleared up by using more careful language. And sometimes philosophers, despite themselves, play with language and redefine words to get around criticism. Many philosophical problems arise, as Wittgenstein says, when language goes on holiday, when words are redefined or taken out of their ordinary habitats where they make sense and used for things they're not really supposed to be used for, in ways that they're not ordinarily used. But there are genuine problems in philosophy. So I meet Wittgenstein halfway. A lot of the time, he probably had a point about philosophy, but that doesn't mean there are no philosophical problems. We just have to be especially vigilant when it comes to our language, catch out people who misuse, misunderstand it, or play with it to suit their needs, and make sure that the problems we address are genuine problems. Thanks very much for listening. I really enjoyed putting this one together, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Do stay tuned if you'd like to see more content like this, and we'll see you next time at Breaking the Game.